Good morning and welcome to ArtSpeaks 2021. We continue our 26th season with today's live virtual talk by film scholar Christina Lane. My name is Glenn Tomlinson and I'm the William Randolph Hearst Curator of Education at the Norton Museum of Art. And I want to thank you for supporting the Norton Museum of Art with your membership and for supporting our education programs for children and youth by joining ArtSpeaks. Please remember that today's virtual ArtSpeaks talk will be available to ArtSpeaks members via login, the login that brought you here today, for 7 days following the live lecture. If you have member friends who might wish to join this program, they still may by registering online at norton.org. We'll have a short Q&A at the end of today's talk. If you have questions during the course of the talk, please type them into the chat box, which opens on the right side of your screen, and we'll address them at the conclusion of the presentation. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Christina Lane is Associate Professor of Film Studies in the Cinematic Arts Department at the University of Miami, where she teaches courses on directors and cinema history. She has served as the chair of the department since 2015. She's written extensively on film history, aesthetics, and women's media production, including Feminist Hollywood, From Born in Flames to Point Break in 2000. And in 2011, Magnolia, the first book-length treatment of the Paul Thomas Anderson film. Christina has published journal articles in Cinema Journal, the Quarterly Review of Film and Television, Cinephiles, and the Journal of Popular Film and TV. She also has essays in various edited collections, including Culture, Trauma, and Conflict, Cultural Studies Perspectives on War, Authorship, and Film, Hollywood Transgressor, the films of Catherine Bigelow, Feminism Goes to the Movies, and Hitchcock and Adaptation. She has published widely on the work of Jodie Foster, Susan Seidelman, and Sofia Coppola. She's also a member of the Women Film Critics Circle and has provided commentary to such outlets as Airmail, NPR, Turner Classic Movies, and the Daily Mail. Christina's topic today is the subject of her most recent book, Phantom Lady, Hollywood Producer, Joan Harrison, The Forgotten Woman Behind Hitchcock, published last year by Chicago Review Press. The museum store does have several copies of this book for sale online. Author on film and friend of the Norton Museum, Scott Eyman, has written, quote, Christina Lane's Phantom Lady brings this fascinating, beautiful, and most of all, talented woman out of time's shadow with a biography that navigates Harrison's life with the same savvy Harrison used to thrive in Hollywood. It restores her to her rightful position as a primary architect of film noir. Christina, it's a pleasure to have you join us here today for ArtSpeaks. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me here today. I'm going to speak today about Joan Harrison, the producer who's the subject of my book, Phantom Lady. I'll also speak a bit about Alma Reville, who was Alfred Hitchcock's wife and also a very influential contributor to Alfred Hitchcock's films. Phantom Lady, my book on Joan Harrison, focuses on her life. So just as kind of an introduction to who she was, she joins Alfred Hitchcock in Britain as a 26-year-old. She applies to a job, an ad that he places for a personal assistant in 1933. And she's a graduate of Oxford and the Sorbonne. She has gone to the Sorbonne and graduates from Oxford. And within just a couple of years of joining his team as an assistant or secretary, she has become an Oscar-nominated screenwriter for Rebecca, for Foreign Correspondent, has worked on a number of his films, then goes on to become a producer in her own right in Hollywood, and eventually produces the Alfred Hitchcock Presents television series. So I was really interested in her life, both in terms of the life that she lived, which is quite fascinating, the career that she had with Alfred Hitchcock, and her own career as a professional woman navigating the waters in Hollywood. But I also became interested in the fact that there were so many women who contributed to Hitchcock's career, who really hadn't been celebrated, but also the dots hadn't been connected in terms of kind of why Alfred Hitchcock tended to collaborate with women. And we name, say, Joan Harrison Alma Reville, but also Sally Benson, who was a co-writer on Shadow of a Doubt, J. Preston Allen, who was the writer of Marnie. And there were a number of women when Alfred Hitchcock began in the early 1920s who mentored him at the beginning when he was working at famous Players Lasky in Britain, who really brought him along in terms of his training and his thinking about film. So that was really my interest in writing this book, kind of where this book came from, is to ask two questions really. Why were women so influential in Alfred Hitchcock's career and his thinking about film? And also, why and how have they become kind of so marginalized? How is it that they haven't become better known? And this importance of female collaborators, how has that not been a bigger part of the discussion of Hitchcock's oeuvre? So one of the reasons that I think that this has happened actually has to do with Alfred Hitchcock's working methods, with his methodology in terms of filmmaking. The producer, John Houseman, who worked with Alfred Hitchcock when he first came to Hollywood in the early 1940s, described this in a really, I think, in a really kind of personable way, right? In a relaxed way, where he said working with Alfred Hitchcock really meant listening to him talk, listening to his anecdotes, his situations, his characters, his revelations, his reversals, which he would think up at night and then he would try out on us writers and producers during the day. And what this means is that if you were a writer with Hitchcock, you would essentially join him in the morning in his living room or in his parlor, and he would begin to kind of bounce things off of you. And by lunchtime, he would send you off on your way to start, writing at the typewriter and try to pound some of this out in terms of the ideas that as a writer you had strung together. But the most important point is that Hitchcock kind of thought about things in terms of kernel moments or vignettes or kind of visual episodes, right? But he was not somebody who put all that together. He was not a writer, and he was not somebody who thought in terms of structure, nor did he think in terms of character. So he needed collaborators, he needed a whole group, but he particularly needed writers who could really put all of this into a form and also help think questions of character motivation. Why are these people in this particular scene? And he also was great at bringing writers in and disarming them and helping them feel like they actually weren't really writing. And so he made people feel as though they were not part of the process and that he was the leader of the process. And this was particularly important in understanding why people would kind of walk away from a day of work with him and feel like they hadn't actually gotten anything done. And it was kind of a mystified process, where in fact they were doing the work, but they didn't necessarily feel that they could take the credit for doing the work. And so we can start the PowerPoint, actually, if you don't mind. Thanks. And just to say that the process that I'm describing suggests that Alfred Hitchcock was really better. His films were more successful when he was very well supported. His films were weaker when he was kind of taking the lead and he didn't have a great team behind him. But if he had a very good director of photography, art director, editor, and screenwriter, then you can see where his films would go through these amazing cycles and he would have 3, 4, 5 very strong films because he would have these team members to help him sort all of these, kernel moments out into movies, right? Into big movies. So this is partly where Joan Harrison comes in, and I will tell her story in just a few minutes. If you could go to the next slide, it would be great. This is the story of Joan Harrison, where I was saying, she kind of starts by answering this ad, and she describes it. This is actually the ad that Joan Harrison says she answered, for a young lady of the highest educational qualifications, and she must speak, write, and read French and German fluently. But I actually wanted to say that everything begins with Alma Reville. And so if we could go to the next slide, it would be helpful because I wanted to tell the story about when Alfred Hitchcock meets his wife, Alma Reville, and why Alma Reville's influence is so important. And the reason is because Joan Harrison's joining of the team of Hitchcock and Alma Reville is critical. But I can't really tell that story until I tell the story of Hitchcock and Alma Reville's meeting. Um, so so Charles Champlin, the Los Angeles Times critic, was when Alma Reville passed away, he said, basically writing an obituary for her, that the Alfred Hitchcock touch, had 4 hands, and 2 of those were Alma's. Right. So he gave Alma Reville an incredible amount of credit. Um, Alma Reville started working with Hitchcock in, say, 1923, and continued to consult with him and work with him until the end of their careers in the mid 1970s. So across the span of 50 years, they were dual collaborators. She was actually working in the movies before Hitchcock was working in the movies. So she began at the age of 16 in London at Twickenham Studios. Essentially, she entered the movies as what they call a cutter, working in the editing department, literally cutting films. And she had 4 years of experience before Hitchcock came along and was working, basically entered the studio, and across the room, he sees Alma Reville. And it took him a couple of more years to work up the guts to speak to her, because she had such a higher position than he did. But by the time he met her in 1921, 4 years of experience that she had been a cutter, an editor, a script supervisor. She'd worked in continuity. She'd been a second assistant director, an associate producer, and the all-important role of floor director, which is kind of running everything on the floor. So that when he got his first film assignment, got up the nerve to call Alma. And I think because at that point he felt that he had some kind of authority, he asked her to join his team, I believe as his second assistant director. And what he would do then over the next couple of years as they were making films together, every time he filmed a shot, he would turn to her and he would say, "Madam, was that all right?" And if she said that the shot looked okay, then it was a go. And this was the pattern that they had from then on out, where he really didn't move forward with anything, a script, a casting choice, a shot, an editing sequence, without running it by her. And that's not because she was some kind of, you know, she didn't have like a strong arm. It's really because she'd had a really expertise. It was because of her expertise. She was already publishing articles in trade journals about how to conceptualize and think about cinema. So she really did bring Hitchcock along in terms of his conceptualization of guiding the spectator through film, which is something that we now, after kind of 100 years of cinema, really look to Hitchcock and think about him as an auteur, the way that he has kind of taught movie makers to think about and conceptualize cinema. So by the time Joan Harrison enters the picture, which is again in 1933, Alma and Hitchcock have actually developed kind of what they call like a private code of translating their ideas, or Hitchcock's kind of visual ideas, into a transcription or a way of putting this onto the script, a visual language that then he understands when he goes to the screenplay and he is going to produce that for the screen. When Alma Reville, basically what happens is Joan Harrison joins their team at a time when Alma Reville needs to kind of recede back, and she's going to be working on projects that don't involve Alfred Hitchcock. So they really do need Joan Harrison in a big way. He needs somebody to kind of come in and fill in a gap that Alma Reville is leaving behind. Also, Hitchcock is joining a new studio where he's about to, whether he knows it or not, embark on one of the most important cycles of films that he's going to make, which is at Gaumont Studios, at British Gaumont Studios. And so when he places that ad and he's looking for a personal assistant, it's a really important position that Joan Harrison is going to fill. She goes in for this interview in the fall of 1933, and she basically kind of lies her way, right? She kind of fibs her way to the front of the line because she sees that waiting for Alfred Hitchcock are like, and she basically changes the story over and over again as she tells the story through decades of time. But it's either 40 women or 80 women or 100 women or hundreds of women who are in line to be interviewed at Hitchcock's office to be his personal assistant. And when she realizes that it's 10 minutes to 1 o'clock and she probably is not going to get into this office before 1 o'clock, which she feels is the deadline, she goes up to the front of the line and she says to the commissionaire who's running the line that she must get in to see Alfred Hitchcock because her sister's having a baby. And so, please let her in before she goes to the hospital. And all of this is kind of true. She does have a sister, but her sister is not married and is not having a baby. So the commissionaire rushes her in and she gets into Alfred Hitchcock's office. And you have to kind of understand who Joan Harrison is. I think maybe if we could go to the next slide, it would be great. It might help. Oh, maybe we could go to the next slide if you don't mind. Thanks. Just hop ahead one. Okay, thanks. So Joan Harrison is all the way to your right, right? So she's a glamorous woman. She's very poised, right? She puts herself together very well. She comes from a family, a newspaper family that insisted on her being very well bred. And while you can't see it here, she's also kind of a stunning blonde. And so in my book, I talk about the fact that I believe she's the original Hitchcock blonde, the prototype for Grace Kelly and Tippi Hedren and Kim Novak. And so when Alfred Hitchcock sees Joan Harrison, I think he kind of falls for her in that way. He sees a beautiful woman, and she's wearing this prim and proper hat that her mother had told her that she should wear for this professional interview. And the first thing that he says is, please remove your hat. So she takes off her hat, which she sees as a sign, a good sign, that he wants to maybe see, unfortunately, see what she looks like. This is a different time. And then he says, do you speak German? Because he needs a woman or he needs an assistant who can help translate for the German crew and actors on the film that he's filming, which is The Man Who Knew Too Much, which has Peter Lorre in it and also a German art director. Well, at that point, her heart sinks because she's majored at Oxford in modern languages, but she specialized in French. And so she plays coy and she kind of turns it around and says, no, but I speak French. And apparently he kind of gets the joke and he's won over by her. And he says, well, I'm famished and it's almost 1 o'clock, so let's go to lunch. And they just find that they're kindred spirits over that lunch, that actually it's really not about Joan Harrison's, physical appearance, that he finds that she loves true crime, just like he does, that she loves mysteries, that she's seen every movie that Hitchcock's ever made, but also she loves cinema. And so Hitchcock and Joan very quickly become Hitchy and Joni. They become collaborators. And what I think is really important, and I wanted to kind of refer back to a little bit, is that the writing process then becomes this interesting triangular writing process. And it had been this way with Alma Reville, Hitchcock, and what we call kind of this third writer in the room, which tended to be a male writer. Now it becomes this way with Hitchcock, Joan, and another male writer. And this is because Hitchcock always needed somebody who could do dialogue, and these tended to be kind of this third writer that he would bring in. Which is to say that Charles Barr, who is a British scholar, has kind of identified this dynamic that would happen that kind of explains the gender dynamics and the complicated gender dynamics of Hitchcock's films, where in the writing room there tended to be a dominant male writer, say Charles Bennett in the case of these early British films, and then the constant presence of a reliable female voice, whether it would be Alma or Joan Harrison. And so one voice would sometimes be working with or working against the other. And then Hitchcock would be kind of the third point. And why this is important is because when we look at Hitchcock's films, While some people might look at them and say, wow, Hitchcock tended to be a misogynist, right? Or his films tended to be violent toward women, or he tended to objectify women in his cinematography or something. The truth is that his films are really complicated in the way that men and women relate to each other, in the way that the camera shows us the female point of view. Often we're looking and we're gliding with the women in the film so that we feel for the women in the film. And that can only be explained by something like this, where you do have multiple people and multiple voices in the room who are kind of hashing things out in a very kind of multi, logical way, rather than monological or kind of one voice way. Um, by the way, when Joan Harrison gets, and this is to move on, we can maybe go back one slide if you don't mind. Thanks. Go backwards one. When Joan Harrison gets the job, she turns out to be the worst secretary that Alfred Hitchcock has ever had. Within 3 weeks, he realizes that she can't type, she can't take dictation, she can't take story notes, she can't answer phones. She's basically in a foreign world for her. But what she can do is, thank goodness, much better. She's great at story. She's great at character. She's really meant to be a screenwriter, and actually very soon she takes on the role of a creative producer, which is to say, kind of the glue that holds movie making together. She helps to find material. She's kind of the gateway in terms of finding short stories, plays, novels, and adapting them through the whole process to help get them onto the screen. And as I was saying, this happens at this pivotal moment when Hitchcock is at Gaumont British. So this cycle is when he's making The Man Who Knew Too Much, The 39 Steps, Sabotage, The Secret Agent, and then eventually Jamaica Inn, which Joan Harrison gets a screenwriting credit on, and The Lady Vanishes, which she's very influential on. If you look at these, basically they're kind of two different genres that are emerging, and they're going to define Hitchcock's career for the rest of his life, which is the serial comic thriller, say on your screen right, where you're looking at the 39 Steps, which is a man and a woman kind of coming together and working out the difficulties of coupling while they're on a thriller adventure. So it's both serious and comic, and it's very much about coupling. And then also on your screen left, where we're looking at The Lady Vanishes, this thread is much more the gothic femme noir, the psychological thriller, where a woman, I don't want to say she's a damsel in distress, but she's kind of a woman who's having trouble understanding what she's seeing. So it's about the complication of vision and knowledge in a male-dominated world. And Joan Harrison was interested in both of these things, but definitely she leaned toward these questions of the gothic femme noir. So, and all of these had to do with the Hitchcock brand. In fact, when Hitchcock was at Gaumont British, he had his own unit within the studio. It was actually called the Hitchcock unit. So whereas other units were, say, the horror unit or the comedy unit, he was his own brand, which is to say he was his own genre. And then within that Hitchcock genre, there were these subgenres that I'm talking about. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that there were two important literary influences on Hitchcock. One of them was Alma Reville, who often brought him material, and with obviously he didn't make anything without Alma Reville giving a green light. And then also Joan Harrison, and her own interests really influenced Hitchcock to the point where you notice a turning point in his career that basically influences his choices for the next few decades. And so these female literary influences are really important. And of course, the novels or the short stories that Joan Harrison are bringing him, they're also written by women. So, written by Daphne du Maurier, written by Ethelina, I'm forgetting the woman who wrote the Lady Vanishes. And so I'm sure that you can correct me in the discussion, but her name is escaping me now. A lot of women writers were coming into Hitchcock's work at this point. We see this in The Lady Vanishes and Jamaica Inn, but we especially see this as we move into Rebecca and Suspicion, which is in the Hollywood films. So if we could move actually one slide and then two slides ahead. Great. Okay. When Hitchcock makes the move to Hollywood in 1939, this is when Hitchcock bids adieu to England, right? And he enters the international spotlight. David O. Selznick brings Hitchcock and his family to Hollywood. And Selznick lures him there with the promise of a big epic film. And it turns out to be Rebecca, which stars, as you probably know, uh, Joan Fontaine and Laurence Olivier, and an all-star cast. And the only person that Hitchcock brings besides his wife and child, Patricia, is Joan Harrison. So this is the only colleague that he makes a point of bringing across to the United States from England with him. And that's because he sees her as his producer. And in fact, when they come across to do their first kind of tour of the United States, um, Joan Harrison travels with them on the ship, and she signs her name on the ship's charter, Joan Hitchcock. So by now, she truly is a part of the family. She's traveling with them to every city you can think of in Europe. This is before the war begins to, it's clear that the war is building up and they can travel. She stays with them in hotels. She celebrates every family vacation or every family holiday with them. And then when they do move to Hollywood in the spring of 1939, they move to Los Angeles. They actually all live together. Essentially, she lives in an apartment just below them. So they are both very personally bound as kind of family and then professionally bound. And if you want me to discuss a little bit more about this in the discussion in terms of what the relationship is like between Joan Harrison and Alma Reville, I'm happy to do that because there were certainly some tensions in terms of Hitchcock's own kind of, I would say, infatuation with Joan Harrison and the way that Alma Reville felt about that. But also, Alma and Joan were very good friends at the same time, and they worked together as co-writers on many films. So as Hitchcock begins his professional adventure, I should say, or his American adventure, Joan Harrison also begins her American adventure. She plays this really vital role in adapting the novel of Rebecca, which she brought to Hitchcock as a novel that she thought he should make. She was friends with Daphne du Maurier, and she worked behind the scenes in all these back channels to help get that novel picked up by David O. Selznick and then made by Hitchcock. And one of the reasons that she was fascinated by, you can maybe move, I'm sorry, just to the next slide. One of the reasons she was fascinated by Rebecca is because it's a novel that really delved deep into the questions of how this female protagonist who goes unnamed in the book, she's the second Mrs. De Winter, feels less than the first Mrs. De Winter. She basically marries this man who seems to be quite distant and brooding, and it turns out that he may have murdered his first wife. And so this woman who's an orphan and she's kind of disenfranchised finds that she's having an identity crisis and a power struggle that goes so deep that she's actually willing to kind of lose herself in the process of loving her husband. So she's willing to it's about self annihilation. She's willing to essentially annihilate herself while she's finding that she's identifying with or looking at kind of this idealized image of femininity in Rebecca, the first Mrs. De Winter, and wondering who she is, but also trying to please her husband. So Joan Harrison was really interested in these questions, and here Joan and Hitchcock are planning. This is obviously a publicity still, but they're planning the film on the lot of the Selznick Studios. If you could go to the next slide, that would be great. So here we go, right? So this is Joan Fontaine kind of finding her way around the Manderley estate, which is the mansion that becomes the architecture, and the setting of the mansion becomes a kind of a stand-in for her own psychological claustrophobia and her own psychological journey into her insecurities. So Harrison's primary interest was character and how to bring. I've gone into Harrison's writer's files at the University of Texas at Austin. So I was able to basically look at what Harrison's own primary preoccupations were as she was doing the writing and the rewrites. She worked on this film for 18 months and was kind of the person who, while there were 5 writers, saw through the project from the beginning to the end, and was also even there in post-production, sitting next to David O. Selznick in the editing suite when Hitchcock had already kind of moved on to the next project. So Harrison was really interested in how to bring this perspective of the second Mrs. De Winter to life through powerfully charged feminine objects that were in the home that seemingly carried little weight, like a hairbrush or a fork, but really carried a lot of weight to the main character. So I would love to show a clip. I've got a clip, and we probably don't have sound, but I can still talk you through um, some of the things to look at, which is here. Joan Fontaine is she's kind of been installed by her husband, Maxim de Winter, played by Laurence Olivier. So this is our unnamed protagonist, and it's suggested to her on one of her first days in Manderley. I'm imagining a lot of you have seen this film, but I am going to set up the clip, right? That she go to the day room and that she kind of do her routine. She's not sure what that routine is supposed to be. So the point that I wanted to kind of make here is that the set is enormous, right? That door that we just saw, the doorknob is basically at shoulder height, and everything is overwhelming to her. She's looking there at the inscribed R on Rebecca's own monogrammed address book. So then she's haunted, by Rebecca De Winter, and she's basically at every point there's a cue, that she's not good enough. She picks up the phone and someone asks for Mrs. De Winter. And she says, "Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. De Winter has died," right? She's not here, she's passed away. And then she jumps and she realizes, well, I just told somebody that I'm dead. Then we have Mrs. Danvers, who is the head house mistress, right? She runs the house. And she, as we know, is kind of like part of the ghost story because she haunts Joan Fontaine's character and she tries to rule the home. And she also, there's an implication that she was in love with Rebecca, but at the very least, she really is a stand-in for Rebecca. So at this particular moment, our unnamed, protagonist is really in that inferior position. She's seated where Mrs. Danvers is standing up. We have this very elaborate kind of setting in the back with the candelabras and a lot of the kind of, I would say, kind of thick, dense mise en scène. Everything is Baroque in terms of the setting that is behind her and the curtains, a lot of the shadows and a lot of the fabrics, right? And then she's going to knock down this Cupid, which is a little statuette or figurine that breaks into a bunch of pieces that she's going to hide in a drawer so that she feels that she's not in control of her environment. And the little Cupid is another one of these charged objects that is just indicative or symbolic of her own feelings of insignificance. If she had any sense of power, she would just come out and tell Mrs. Danvers, "Oh, look, I broke this. Will you please take it into town, or throw it away?" So yeah, so we can stop there. It's a great example of how everything comes together. The mise en scène, which is to say essentially the set designs, the props, the costumes, and then also the camera work, which works very hard to show you her perspective, kind of over the shoulder camera work, but also these close-ups and these reaction shots that place you deeply inside the perspective of Joan Fontaine's character. And then if we can go to the next slide, what happens in that very same room, in that very same space, about 30 minutes later in the film, is that Joan Fontaine's character has come into her own power. A whole lot has happened in the film where she now knows a lot more information. Hitchcock is great at disclosing information at the right time, right? And I should say the Hitchcock team is great at disclosing information at the right time. And so now she stands up to Mrs. Danvers, and she stands up at the desk. They're now at equal height. And now Mrs. Danvers, you can see, is filmed in that middle shot, in that middle slide, is filmed at a different angle so that she looks like she's a little bit less powerful. And in that final shot, Joan Fontaine's character says, "I am Mrs. De Winter now." So she makes this announcement that I am in control and you will do what I tell you to do, which is a great claiming of the self, which is a great claim of her name and the space. These are all things that Hitchcock was interested in, but Joan Harrison was much more interested in. And you don't have to take my word for it, or I guess you can take the film. The film itself stands on its own, but it's really helpful for me, I suppose, to come back to you from the files, right, and tell you that there's a lot of archival evidence to show that that the woman writer Joan Harrison was really infusing a lot of these interests, her own interests, into the film and into the characters. So I suggest that we think about it as a dialogue, because in the writing process, Harrison was talking about a lot of this with Hitchcock, right, which then made Hitchcock more interested in these ideas. So they shaped each other, and then eventually they're going to part. And Hitchcock goes on to make other films, but these ideas continue to live with Hitchcock. So if you see these ideas in other films of his, it's very likely because of the conversations that he and Joan Harrison had in these formative years between 1934 and 1942. Then what happens, and if you don't mind, you could go to the next slide for me, thanks, is that after Rebecca, Suspicion, Foreign Correspondent, and Saboteur in Hollywood between 1940 and 1942, Joan Harrison really begins to feel that she has movies of her own that she wants to make, and that it's time to leave Hitchcock's fold. So she makes a break as a solo producer, and she enters the Hollywood studio system as the first, at least in the 1940s, she's the first woman producer in the studio system. Following her will be two more women. So there are three women producers throughout the 1940s that are in the studio system. Very few of them, and Harrison is one of the three. But I like this image, right? This is actually Joan Harrison in her house, and she's doing a huge photo shoot for Time Life, where she's essentially recrafting her own persona as a glamorous woman. And she says she's the mistress of suspense. So she's going to make movies that have Hitchcock overtones that are for women. So she's learned from Hitchcock that creating your persona, creating a brand, is really important. And so she does begin to brand herself as a star. And that's what these images suggest, is that she's a powerhouse, but she's also, kind of a feminine powerhouse. She plays on her own fashion, like she's a fashion trendsetter in the early 1940s. And the first film that she really makes a break with is at Universal in 1944. She produces Phantom Lady, which is an adaptation of the Cornell Woolridge novel. And so if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. With Phantom Lady, she makes this film starring Ella Raines as a Girl Friday, a secretary turned detective who takes on an investigation to prove her boss is not a killer. So she has to go search out this Phantom Lady who was wearing a phantom hat, and the hat is the alibi. If she can find the hat, then she can prove that her boss didn't kill his wife, But the point of this plot summary is that it truly does take film noir, which was just kind of emerging. In fact, 1944 is the year of the Maltese Falcon, the year of Double Indemnity, and the year of Phantom Lady. And it basically tries to inscribe a lot of feminist tropes onto what was a very new movement. And then um, Joan Harrison goes on in the 1940s to become a really important influencer on noir. And if you could move to the next slide for me, thanks. She makes Ride the Pink Horse, starring Robert Montgomery. She's actually in a production company as the producer with Robert Montgomery, who's directing his films, and she's producing them. Ride the Pink Horse is a fabulous film that also has a lot of feminist twists and turns. She makes They Won't Believe Me, and these are two films. Well, They Won't Believe Me is at RKO. Ride the Pink Horse was at Universal, but she's basically producing at RKO and Universal. So when all is said and done, because these are two films that I do recommend by her, she has developed or written 8 films with Hitchcock. She has produced 8 films of her own in the 1940s. And then in the 1950s, she has a really prolific career producing television. So she actually produces 5 different TV series, but the one that you will know is the Alfred Hitchcock Presents TV series. If you could go to the next slide, that would be great. Yeah. So although Hitchcock and she really didn't do much work together after Saboteur, in 1955, when Hitchcock does make the decision to produce Alfred Hitchcock Presents, it's Lew Wasserman, right? It's kind of the head of MCA Universal, a mega agent, who turns to Hitchcock and says, there's only one person who can produce your television series, and it's Joan Harrison. It wasn't Hitchcock that decided to hire her. It was Lew Wasserman who encouraged that hire. So she comes in and she is the producer of that show for 10 years. She produces about 270 episodes of that television show. And all in all, her career is really kind of spectacular. And at the same time, she also has a really interesting romantic life. Right around the time she's producing this show, she marries Eric Ambler, the modern spy novelist. Eric Ambler has been credited with inventing the modern spy thriller. So in 1958, they marry and they have kind of a star couple kind of marriage, at least in their circles. And also, if you could go to the next slide. Thanks. We're wrapping up the slideshow. So Eric Ambler is in the top right slide. If you're from your perspective, he's in the top right. But she also had what someone told me, someone who knew her, what someone told me was a very expansive romantic life. So she dated Clark Gable, actually nearly married Clark Gable in the early 1950s. She dated Kirk Douglas, Irwin Shaw, Billy Wilder, and it goes on and on and on. So she had a lot of romantic liaisons, and she really didn't, for a long time, publicly said she didn't necessarily believe in marriage as it was in the 1930s and 1940s. So she was an interesting character in terms of her personal life. And those, I guess, the critique of marriage and romance and family was something that came out in her films often. So that's something that I write about in the book, because the book is both a biography of her career and also a biography of her personal life. And those are the biggest surprises, honestly, for me, was being able to find out more about her personal life. So I think that one of the takeaways as I kind of begin to close is, again, kind of why these women have been so marginalized. And one of the reasons is because Alfred Hitchcock was able to write his own history in the 1960s and 1970s as his career was still actually very prolific in the 1960s, right? Francois Truffaut helped build this renaissance with the book Hitchcock Truffaut and a series of interviews. And then also there was this retrospective in colleges and film festivals in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Basically, this whole new wave of interest in Alfred Hitchcock. And also, as he was toward the end of his life, biographies were being written around him. So he was able to give a sense of his own, right? He was able to kind of write his own career, and also to take credit, which is something he did where he might not have necessarily deserved credit, and to kind of push some others off to the side. He did this with both women and men. So Joan Harrison basically didn't get some credit where credit was due in that for that reason, and she never wrote a biography, and there were not publishers looking for her biography. At the same time, in the 1970s, there was a real interest as second wave feminist movements grew in looking for women filmmakers from the past as role models. But those feminist filmmakers or feminist critics tended to look for directors. They tended to look, they too were buying into auteur theory. So they tended to look for women directors, and they didn't really think of women producers when they were out looking for role models. So Joan Harrison, while she was still alive at that time, was not really being asked about her career. So that's one reason why what we think of as the great genius theory continued to be upheld. And people like Joan Harrison, she wasn't the only one, tended to be basically marginalized. So in Phantom Lady, one of the things that I propose is that it's not just really, people have said for a long time that Alfred Hitchcock made Joan Harrison, right? That she was an appendage to his career, and that she, if not for Alfred Hitchcock, Joan Harrison would not be Joan Harrison. But I really try to flip that around and say that Joan Harrison helped to make Alfred Hitchcock, and that we need to think about a lot of these women's quote unquote side stories and move them onto center stage and really honor these women for the primary authors that they were and that they are. So now I will welcome Glenn back and hopefully move toward the discussion section of the talk.
Thank you so much, Christina. What a fascinating story, and so much to reveal, and so many questions it opens up. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the themes of Joan Harrison's films?
Yeah, I would love to. And so, you know, one of the things that she was most interested in, especially when you look at these films that she was producing on her own, was looking at the way that institutions of, or just in general, you know, marriage or family tended to be confining in the 1940s, because you have to think about it in the context of, you know, kind of post World War II history. But she found them confining for both women and men, right? And so she really had a broad critique of gender and the kind of social constructs that were in place. And so I think that she was actually very brave, right, and bold in the way that she would use the noir genre, which was always at the time, noir was being used to critique the American dream. You know, it was a kind of fatalistic genre that would always, you know, end up that, you know, there were never like happy endings for noir. So it was implicitly critiquing things like marriage. You didn't have happy marriages in noir, but she would use it really to draw a lot of that out and look at why it was that relationships were so difficult to in terms of equality, right? For example, why relationships were so difficult to sustain.
Is it difficult? I'm looking at a comment from one of our guests who says he's been enjoying a Hitchcock Film Festival. Last movie watched was Sabotage. Have read the Truffaut book and watched the doc. Grew up with the TV series. Love him. Is it what kind of challenge is it for you to represent Joan Harrison and as not only Hitchcock's, perhaps his kind of an equal, or someone who actually helped him become who he became. And what has the response been to your book?
Yeah, you know, and one thing I should say is I love Hitchcock movies, right? I'm a big Hitchcock fan. So so you know, when I watch something like the Hitchcock Truffaut interviews, I get into all of that as well. And it's only really maybe like a day or two later when I look back and I say, well, how many women were interviewed for that documentary, right? Or, you know, why didn't they really bring up they bring up Alma Reville, but why didn't they bring up Joan Harrison? So So it has been difficult to basically find angles, like entry points to bring this narrative into what is a really, really basically persistent narrative, right? That Hitchcock is the driving force behind his films. Um, it's an easier narrative to basically suggest that Hitchcock kind of basically came up with every shot and came up with every story, and to speak in shorthand about the idea that Hitchcock kind of was the, again, kind of basically Hitchcock made his movies. That's a lot easier to refer to than to try to break it all down, which obviously we also can't do. But I should say that I've been really pleasantly surprised by the positive response from Hitchcock biographers and scholars, because writing this as I was sitting down, every day like a blank screen, it was mortifying to think that I might be called out, right, or challenged or criticized by those who really do um, only write kind of in the Hitchcock vein. And the opposite has happened. I've been so heartened by not only people who have celebrated the book kind of publicly by giving the book endorsements, but also just written me privately and said, well, you got that right, and I'm really glad that, you've added this to the literature. So I haven't been criticized. I'm like, when is it going to come?
Well, we would hope not. We would certainly hope not. Another question has just come up. Can you tell us anything about Joyce Selznick?
Wow. No, actually, I don't know much about Joyce Selznick. So if, if I'd love more. I'd love to know more. Yeah.
I'm watching the chat to see if anything appears there, but
Yeah.
Well, I really want to thank you for introducing this fascinating figure to our audience today, and congratulations on a wonderful book.
Thank you.
And we look forward to continuing to hear what you're doing at the University of Miami and future projects.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Well, folks, I just want to add that we look forward to being joined in February for our next ArtSpeaks program. And ladies and gentlemen, I just want to invite you back to a talk related to the museum's Chinese collection and the Lunar New Year. Join us for a lecture by Stephen Little. He is the Florence and Harry Sloan Curator of Chinese Art and the head of the Chinese, Korean, and South and Southeast Asian departments at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. An impressive scholar on Chinese art, Little has the gift for making this content accessible to all. And he'll discuss a master of Ming Dynasty painting, the subject of his recent exhibition called Where the Truth Lies, The Art of Chu Ying. The presentation takes place on Thursday, February 11th at 2 p.m. Until then, thank you, take care, and best wishes to you all.